Welcome back to this briefing on the basics of K-12 public education in the United States. As a reminder, the briefing makes four points. First, that the purpose of public education is contested. Second, the system is highly decentralized. Third, that how well our schools are doing depends on who you ask. And fourth, that improving our schools is a serious management challenge. When you finish watching this series of videos, you should have a better understanding of why the system works the way it does and be better able to anticipate how new change efforts might unfold in the future. The briefing is organized in 4 parts, each posted as a separate recording. This is part 2. The system is highly decentralized. There are nearly 13,500 local school districts in the United States, shown on this map from the National Center for Education Statistics. About 50 million students attend approximately 100,000 public schools, spread across these many local education agencies, or LEAs. Corcoran and Gertz address the governance of U.S. public education in a chapter in Public Schools edited by Furman and Lazarson. They explain that, quote, constitutional authority for education resides in the states, a reserved power arising from the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. States, in turn, decide how much authority to retain and how much power to give to local education agencies, schools, and parents. The extent of this delegation varies widely across the states, reflecting different political histories, traditions, and political cultures, end quote. This creates an extremely fragmented system, so much so that it is hard to actually say that we have one public education system in the United States. It's really 50 different systems with 13,500 different ways of implementing, interpreting, and prioritizing within the established policy framework. The current state, remarkably, actually reflects several decades of consolidation. Since 1950, there has been a consolidation of school districts from over 80,000, and states and federal government have been taking more control over education policy. But, quote, even as the federal and state governments increase their role in education policy, local control continues to predominate in the United States. Local school districts retain primary responsibility for curriculum and instruction, the hiring and assignment of teachers and principals, the funding of schools, and the operation and maintenance of school buildings. Looking at where the money comes from reinforces the point about the distribution of power and the limited role of the federal government. The pie chart on the left shows that less than 10% of funding for public schools comes from federal funds, while over 90% comes from state and local sources. This way of funding schools opens the door for significant differences we see across the country in how much is spent per student in each state and district. Each state and locality has a different formula for funding schools, contributing to significant differences between states, but also between two districts, even that are right next to each other. The map on the right on your slide, an interactive one if you visit the site, shows this variation in spending across states. Spending ranges from $6,441 per student in Utah to $19,847 per student in the District of Columbia. And this view, by showing average spending at the state level, doesn't even address the significant variation within the states themselves. This highly localized system is unique when compared to other nations. This chart from Kober and Usher's Public Education Primer shows that Canada is the only other G8 nation without a national curriculum or exam. Each of the 50 U.S. states has its own set of standards for what students are expected to learn and tests for measuring progress. And even this is only true since the 90s and early 2000s. It's then up to the local school districts to adopt or develop curriculum to try to meet those standards. In recent years in this country, there has been a movement to adopt a, quote, Common Core set of national standards. The Common Core Standards movement has been a state-led effort led by the National Governors Association, supported by private philanthropy. The federal government has encouraged this process and encouraged states to adopt these standards through funding incentives and competitive grant programs, but the discretion to do so is up to each state. Even in cases where states adopt the Common Core, they often modify with their own variations and still have discretion for how to actually teach and try to meet these standards is up to the 13,500 local education agencies. There are a few links on the slide if you're curious to learn more about this controversial policy issue. So, in this decentralized system, mostly funded and governed by states, what is the federal role in public education? As the quote says on the slide, the federal government plays a limited but influential role in elementary and secondary education. This influence often takes the form of requirements attached to the receipt of federal funds. In the 1950s, the federal role really started to expand with civil rights legislation, National Defense of Education Act of 1958, and ultimately the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, in 1965. This law is still the main federal law governing public education, and it has been reauthorized in various forms since then, including as No Child Left Behind in 2002, and recently the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015. Federal funding primarily is aimed at aiding economically and educationally disadvantaged students by providing funds based on needs in ways that supplement local and state dollars. While this funding is a small percent of overall spending, most states and localities have come to rely on this support from the federal government. This reliance has allowed the federal government to exert increasing influence over local policy by tying requirements to receiving the funds, such as requirements to adopt more rigorous academic standards or ensure the hiring of, quote, highly qualified teachers. Additionally, the federal government has the important responsibility of monitoring and enforcing civil rights requirements related to ensuring educational opportunity for all students. Understanding this governance structure is fundamental to understanding why our system works the way it does and to being able to anticipate how any effort to improve the system will actually play out in practice. Underlying many of the more specific policy debates we hear about education reform is this tension between decentralization and increased central authority. As Corcoran and Gertz write, this complex and fragmented system is a legacy of the deep-seated fear of centralized authority that shaped the nation's founders' views of government. Before judging this structure in its entirety, consider the pros and cons of such a diffuse system of governments, and even how these features might have different value at different times. For example, in her essay, Human Capital Century, Claudia Goldin suggests that this hyper-localized system actually facilitated the rapid proliferation of education in the US, as people could see their tax dollars going to work for their own children and felt pressure to compete with other localities in order to ensure their children were on a level playing field. But today, this same fragmented structure is now seen as producing serious funding inequities. Take a minute to jot down some pros and cons of this kind of system from your perspective. Under what conditions would you be most frustrated by it? Are there any conditions where you would be grateful for it? How would it influence the way a broad change effort might play out in practice? And finally, would you prefer a system that is more centralized? Why or why not?